TP201, Transfer Pricing for Intangibles. Some of our previous videos we've discussed the comparable uncontrolled profits method. We're going to proceed now on to the next method we want to talk about, which is the resale price method. So what is the resale price method? Well, it evaluates whether the amount charged in a controlled transaction is arm's length by looking at the gross profit margin realized in an uncontrolled transaction. So in the comparable price method, we were looking at the price that somebody charged for something. Now we're going to be looking at the profit margin at a gross profit margin level to come up with the analysis. This is all discussed in the Treasury Regs 42-3, and it's also in the OECD guidelines. So it's a standard method used around the world. And we're measuring essentially the value of the functions performed largely and generally by the distributor. So someone is buying and reselling tangible property, and the reseller is not adding a huge amount of value to this property, but they are adding the function of distribution of it from maybe from a wholesale level out to the actual customers. And we're looking at how much value do they add, how much margin do they add in as they're doing that transaction before they resell. Now, it's most useful when you have a distributor who's purchasing goods from a related party and sells to third parties. This way, you're looking at that profit margin over their sales. Sales have been done to third parties, so the denominator is not distorted at all by a transfer price situation. But maybe an example will make this a little bit clearer. And I will mention that sometimes you'll hear people also refer to this as the resale minus method. Essentially it's saying if we sell it to the ultimate customer at some price, say 100, what margin do we take and keep at the distributor level, with the minus from that, and then say we sold it at 100, we keep say 10%, and then we pay 90 for it to the related party who sold it to us. So, as this would, let's look at it graphically. We're going to start off with a related party that is selling goods, because we're talking about tangibles, to a party who is our taxpayer, the person we're sort of consulting for. And the taxpayer is then going to sell those same goods on to an unrelated party. And we're looking in this kind of a structure and flow of the transaction. So generally, this is not going to be a good method if the reseller's adding a substantial amount of value before reselling. And the reseller here is going to be our taxpayer on this diagram. And when I say a substantial amount of value, that might come from either physically altering the product, like they bought a material but they've done some manufacturing to it and somehow changed its value a lot, or that they're using an intangible property. In other words, they might be buying, say, clothing, but they own the brand name and they sew their labels into the clothing, and then it gets sold at a brand that somebody's going to recognize and get a substantial markup as a result. So that would be a situation in which the resale price method may not work well. Right? So we want to have it where they're not really adding a lot of value except the actual distribution of the good to the unrelated parties. So when we're looking for good comparability factors, here are some of the things that we would care about. How much margin you need to earn at that gross level is going to be affected by, well, what kind of inventories levels do you have to hold to conduct this business? What's your turnover rate of those inventories? What are some of the corresponding risks that might be involved here, right? In other words, if you have one transaction where the distributor is allowed to return unsold inventory, that's not going to be comparable to a transaction where the distributor has to sell that inventory even if they have to mark it down a lot to get it out of the warehouse. You want to be cognizant of the contractual terms. How much gross margin someone's going to need to earn is quite different if they have to pay their invoices within 30 days versus, say, 90 or 120 days. The value of that time value of money is going to affect how much they're willing to pay in COGS for the product that they're receiving. What kind of sales, marketing, advertising programs exist? So often when someone is a distributor, the manufacturer is willing to participate with them in sharing the cost of advertising. Well, if you're trying to compare a controlled transaction to an uncontrolled transaction, you either want that to be the same or to be able to make an adjustment so that you can take that into account properly. What level of the market is very important. Whether you're talking about a transaction, if our related party is selling to the taxpayer and the taxpayer is the wholesale distributor, that's quite different than if you're selling it at the retail level. the wholesaler is going to take on the task of finding all the retail sellers who they're going to then sell on to, and that's quite different. And so try not to ever compare a gross margin of a wholesale distributor to a retail distributor. Maybe one of the ways to think about this is that music stores are a good example. If you walk into a music store at a retail level, they often have a margin as high as 50% or more on those instruments because it's very expensive for them to hold that inventory, maintain the store, all those other issues. Whereas at the wholesale level, wholesalers of musical instruments might only have a 10% gross margin or a 15% gross margin. They're moving a lot of volume and they're not sitting on a lot of inventory. And foreign currency risks are important here too. So what currency are these transactions denominated in? And to make sure that one party or the other may be bearing a foreign currency risk, and you want to make that as comparable as possible, especially if currency markets have been volatile. Well, thanks. That's the end of this first video on the resale price method. We're going to have more, and we're going to go through some examples later in this playlist.
I hope you enjoyed this video. It'd be a great help to us if you would leave comments or give us a like and let us know how we could improve these videos for the future. Thanks and have a great day.